I'm an alcoholic. I was a heavy drinker for more than 20 years. I got sober about 4 years ago. But the internet knows me as an alcoholic. And there is, in those many records out there, the fact that I have clicked on alcohol ads, I have bought alcohol online. And the internet, in a very real way, doesn't want me to stop drinking. The fact that they know that I like to drink is actually very lucrative for them. So when you think about this creates a really interesting ethical conundrum, right? It's not just that these things are creepy, it's that they're literally holding us to our worst selves, even when we sort of try to change and sort of work our way through the future.
That's Ethan Zuckerman, a longtime friend and tech pioneer. From stopping social media that surveils to ending creepy advertising, Ethan has been having and collecting ideas about how to fix the internet for a while now, and he's going to help us imagine a better future with better tools. I'm Cindy Cohn.
And I'm Danny O'Brien. Welcome to How to Fix the Internet, a podcast of the Electronic Frontier Foundation.
Ethan, you teach about tech and social change at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And since you have your own podcast called Reimagining the Internet, I am delighted that we are so in sync. So let's do both. Let's reimagine the internet and fix it too while we're there. Welcome to the show.
Oh, well, thank you, Cindy. And thanks, Danny. It's great to be with you. And I'm so thrilled that we're both looking at this somewhat dark moment as an opportunity to actually make some changes and maybe not even fix, but really imagine ways in which things could be radically different. That's where I really want to push us.
I certainly agree. I don't think you can build a better world unless you can imagine it. And so that has to be the first step. So let's start, though, by mapping the territory a little bit. What are the things that we need to fix right now about the internet?
Well, one of the things that's challenging about that question is that we don't know enough about what's wrong to even have a very good answer to it. There's a lot of hypotheses out there right now that social media in particular is bad for individuals, that it may be bad or corrosive for society. We have everything from evidence that platforms like Instagram are very bad for body image for young women, to questions of whether Facebook is dividing society broadly into camps that are very angry and cannot talk to one another. One of the tricks with this is it's really hard to verify those hypotheses because they're all happening on closed platforms that can actually restrict our access to them. So most of these platforms won't give us an API to do real research and experiments on them. When we've tried to work with platforms like Facebook to actually do these studies, they both dragged their feet and ultimately given people bad data. And then when people have actually tried to go out and sort of scrape information and do studies on their own or use data donation, companies like Facebook have gone ahead and hit them with cease and desist orders. So we have this moment of hypothesis that the internet, particularly social media, may be doing bad things to us. But it's safe to assume at this point that these platforms may not be doing for the world what we and what they hoped they might do.
It's super funny to me that at EFF, we spent many years fighting the NSA and the government over the mass surveillance programs. And one of the tensions you have there in the courts is that all this information about how that works is locked away because it's claimed to be a state secret. And you end up depending on whistleblowers. And now I find it terribly ironic that we're in the same situation with these big tech companies where everything has to depend on these whistleblowers because there's no other way of finding out what's really going on.
Well, let me suggest another irony, Danny. When you and I and Cindy sort of first got involved with this work, we were really worried about state actors controlling speech. We were really worried about the Iranian government or the Chinese government censoring people. And of course, that still continues. Then we grew up a little bit and we started worrying about intermediary censorship. We worried about Facebook controlling speech. We worried about YouTube controlling speech. Then we got a little bit further, and then we worried about the intermediaries not controlling speech, right? So that's the place we're at now. Now we worry about people censoring each other by being so abusive that people are driven offline. We worry about people shaping the political conversation through mis and disinformation, which, one of the big things that we're starting to learn about this Sometimes it persuades people to go down a QAnon rabbit hole. Sometimes it just persuades people just to get out of the space. So we've gone from worrying about governments censoring the net to worrying about platforms censoring the net to now, in some cases, worrying about platforms not doing enough to censor the net. This is not how we should be running a digital public sphere.
This is where we get to reimagining, right? Because it ends in censor more, censor less, right, as your two choices. And as a free speech person who especially worries about marginalized voices, neither of those is a good option, right? Censor more, we know that that's going to disproportionately affect marginalized voices. Censor less, we have the problem that people can't tolerate being on these platforms anymore. That's not good either.
Not only is it censor more or censor less, if we censor more, then the question is it the government who censors? Or is it Facebook who censors?
Yep.
I'm not a big fan of the government censoring, but I'm not a big fan of Facebook censoring either. I don't particularly trust either of those entities to be involved with it. So once you have the critique, there's two things you can do. You can either try to fix it or you can try to reimagine it. So let me give you two examples. If the problem is toxic speech online, a great fix for this is what Tracy Chow is doing with Block Party, right? She's built a whole company around adding features to Twitter that Twitter, frankly, should have. They let you do things like share block lists and block hundreds of people at a time. You can block people just because they liked or retweeted the hateful tweet about what a terrible person you are. Because you can sort of say, frankly, I don't want to engage with that person. I want to control my own space. Yep. So that's a fix, right? And Twitter gets some credit. They maintain an ecosystem where she can come in as a third-party developer and build that fix. Facebook won't let her do that. Facebook will go ahead and send a cease and desist if she tries to do that. Reimagining looks at this and says, wait a second, why are we trying to have a conversation in a space that's linking 300 million people? Maybe this isn't where I want to have my conversation. And you know what? I don't actually want my conversation moderated by poorly paid people in the Philippines who are flipping through a 3-ring binder to figure out if speech is acceptable. What if we built social media around communities of people who want to interact with one another and want to take responsibility for governing those spaces? Now, that's huge and a very, very different way of looking at it.
So let's imagine that we could go back in time and grab the people who were hacking together Twitter and we're able to show them all the consequences. Do you think it's possible to build a global social media system and have it work and have it not like have everybody at each other's throats? Is it just a mistake that Twitter made, or is it a sort of systemic mistake?
So first, I'm not sure you can build a global social media network and have it work. Mm-hmm. I think what you can do is have hundreds of thousands or possibly even millions of social media spaces run by communities around the world and have many of them work. And I think in many ways that's a much better vision. Scale's hard. Having a set of speech rules that work for 10 people around a dinner table, that can be hard in and of itself. Everyone can sort of think of a Christmas meal or a Thanksgiving meal with someone who's really politically out of line with everyone else and the sort of Thanksgiving rules of no politics around the table. But that's 10 people. Once you start trying to scale that to India, Kashmir, or, Palestinians, Israelis, or, Rohingya, Burma, you're really wrestling with some questions that, frankly, most of the people involved with these companies are not qualified to address. And the only solution I've been able to come to out of that is a whole lot of small spaces, all of us moving between them, and some of us taking responsibility for governing at least some of the spaces that we interact in.
Yeah, I remember when EFF first criticized Mark Zuckerberg about reneging on their privacy promises. Remember, Facebook was going to be the privacy one compared to other things, and then they've just slowly rolled back all those promises. And one of the things that we demanded was, you need to give people a voice in this. And so what Facebook came up with is, well, that's okay if a majority of Facebook users all around the world vote for a proposition, we'll do it. And of course, at scale, that's the kind of thing that sounds like democracy, but really isn't. So I agree with you, and I think think there's a mix in here, right? Because we both want things that are smaller in terms of the manageability of the size of it. But the other thing you said was really important is we want to be able to skip between them, right? We don't want to all be locked in small little walled gardens where we can't go from one place to another. So interoperability, interactions, protocols, not platforms, all of these things that we think about and that we talk about on the kind of networky side of things become important in your world.
This feeling of nostalgia about it, right? Because this is very much the idea and the feeling of the early internet. So we had a lot of these small communities and they did thrive and people could move between them. But then they sort of withered away. Faced with Facebook, they weren't able to compete. Why do you think that was? Why do you think that there was a preference there? And why do you think that that's not going to happen again?
So I think it has a lot to do with how capital markets have been structured. We've had three things sort of happen simultaneously. We've moved from an open web where people start lots of small projects to one where it really feels like if you're not on a Facebook or a YouTube, you're not going to reach 1 billion users. And at that point, why is it worth doing this? Mm-hmm. Second, we've developed a financial model of surveillance capitalism where the default model for all of these tools is we're going to collect as much information as we can about you and monetize your attention. And then we've developed a model for financing these, which is venture capital, where we basically say it is your job to grow as quickly as possible to get to the point where you have a near monopoly on a space and you can charge monopoly rents. Get rid of two aspects of that equation and things are quite different. So if you're no longer trying to build things based around advertising, if you're building around subscription or, God forfend, you're actually asking people to support something on a voluntary or, and now I'm getting into really dangerous territory here, careful, as a public good, where you might use taxpayer money to say, actually, it's really important that we have a public space in which we can have a debate and dialogue about what happens in our community. If you start opening up those models, maybe you don't need venture capital anymore to do this. So there are sustainable, long-lasting projects out there that have built very different looking communities. They're not big. They're things like Pinboard. They're things like Arena. They're things like Front Porch Forum. They operate on a very, very different scale. People don't want to give them venture capital funds. Mm-hmm. The problem with them, Danny, is that when they need to do something technically innovative, when they need to do something really inventive, venture capital is a great way to get tens of millions of dollars without an immediate return. And part of what we need is some sort of mechanism so we can do technological innovation at scale and then make it possible for people to run their own community at the cost of $5 a month rather than at the cost of tens of billions of dollars a month.
Are there places where you see that developing? I know you're trying to develop a version of this, but I suspect there might be others as well. But tell us about that.
So this is a hard one as well. This issue has really come into focus for people over the last 2 years or so. I started writing about this idea of digital public infrastructure, this idea that maybe our public spaces should actually be paid for with public dollars about 2 years ago. And in that 2 years, we've seen a new lab at MIT, a new lab at Harvard, the Civic Signals Project out of the University of Texas. We have the Liberty Project with $100 million behind it to build a blockchain-based new social media system with components in Georgetown and at Sciences Po in Paris. You've got interesting efforts coming out of public broadcasters in the UK and in the Netherlands. You have really interesting, what I would call the rise of the deplatformed. And in some ways, that's happening in really great ways. Assembly 4 in Australia is a collective of sex workers who have built their own sex worker-friendly Twitter called Switter. as an alternative to using American-based tools after Sesta Fosta. And they've gone on to build their own back page called Tryst. And they're amazing. They're doing co-design with sex workers. Sex workers run the company. But then there's the dark side of it. You have the folks with Gab who are trying to create their entire media ecosystem, including a Gab ad server and a whole component of Gab advertisers and Gab file storage, because they've been deplatformed. So there's lots of things out there. And there's the territory that I'm not quite sure how to deal with, which are a lot of the people who are trying to do this around the blockchain and around token-based networks, which is a really fascinating mix of hope and grift. And I'm trying to sort of figure out how to navigate that complex space, perhaps more on the hopeful side than on the grift side.
One thing you said earlier is we're worried about a world where these big platforms censor. And we worry about a world where these big platforms don't censor enough. But one of the things that people do say is like, well, don't we need someone who is able to like put their foot down and stop the kind of hate speech that you might see on one of these services? How would they do that in this new model?
I don't think that hateful speech disappears in the model that I'm talking about. Will people build horrible, hateful spaces within the architecture that I'm trying to design? Yeah, absolutely. My hope is that most of us will avoid them. My hope is that those spaces will be less successful in recruiting and pulling people into those spaces. If you're in a community of a couple hundred people and someone starts posting anti-vax propaganda, and you have house rules within your server that you don't allow anti-vax propaganda, you have options. You can confront that person. You can remove the person from the community. You can put those posts behind a click-through wall. You can do all sorts of things because your community is the one making those speech rules. By making speech rules about what a group of people choose, rather than trying to have them be universal, not just for the US, but for the world, you suddenly give yourself a great deal more ability to deal with this sort of hateful speech.
How to Fix the Internet is supported by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation's program in the public understanding of science, enriching people's lives through a keener appreciation of our increasingly technological world and portraying the complex humanity of scientists, engineers, and mathematicians.
I wanted to talk a little bit about advertising because I think you have some ideas about how do we get out of the surveillance advertising world we're in now.
I've started thinking about this question of there's a lot of values-led organizations out there. Libraries are values-led organizations. Nonprofits are values-led organizations. Universities are values-led organizations. What if those producers of content started thinking about different ways to be able to monetize attention? I don't know that there's anything actually wrong with advertising as a particular form of monetizing content. It's a pretty good way of trying to make money from content that people have not chosen to buy, or from a service that people have not chosen to buy. What's problematic about it for me is the surveillance economy that goes with it. So I'm working with a brilliant young man, Chand Rajendra Nicolucci, on this idea of forgetful advertising. And forgetful advertising would be a voluntary opt-in system aimed at those sort of values-driven organizations. It would be able to do a lot of what advertising does right now, but in a single transaction. You know, Danny, it could know what neighborhood you're in London so that it could give you the right ad for Pret-a-Manger, but it can't know the next time it sees you that that's where you had lunch last time. And it can't maintain the profile that sort of says, well, he's the sort of person who looks at these websites and therefore I think I want to sell him this thing. It's a voluntary system. It involves different ad servers passing different key value pairs to figure out how to target an ad. Our guess is that it's probably less lucrative than the pure all-out targeted advertising, But again, a big part of what I'm trying to do right now is sort of explore what's possible if you're willing to consider things beyond pure market forces.
How does this differ from contextual advertising? We talk a lot about the difference between targeted surveillance advertising that tracks you over time and contextual advertising, which is if I type, I want shoes into Google, Google can show me things about shoes because that's where I am right now. That's what I'm wanting.
So you don't want to get rid of that sort of context. That context is very useful. It's by the way, it's probably the majority of Google's business. They actually make less off of the surveillance stuff than they do off of the intention-based targeting. There's another form of contextual where you do an analysis of what web page you're on. Gee, this person is reading about Facebook's metaverse. Maybe I should target them a VR rig. Like that to me seems legitimate as well. That's the same thing as this person is reading the New Yorker. I bet they'd like my ad for a snooty fashion brand. So those things seem fine to me. What's not fine is this data doppelganger we're all carrying around here. If we as human beings are allowed to change and evolve, we have to find some way to be able to outgrow our data doppelgangers, right? It's not just that these things are creepy, it's that they're literally holding us to our worst selves, even when we sort of try to change and sort of work our way through the future.
There are lots of ways in which people are trying to need to be able to grow and evolve and also need to not be lumped in with a bunch of other people who on some level might look like them, but who aren't like them, right? And this is how a lot of the bias and racial problems that we have in some of this targeting comes about.
The model that I ended up suggesting 2 years ago, I think no one's even bothered commenting on because it's so crazy and so improbable. But it's this idea of a tax on surveillance advertising that you use to create a fund that can create new technologies in this space. So you look at that question of how do you get that venture-like money to get something from 10 users to the possibility of hundreds of thousands of users on other nodes. That's not easy. Any of us who built that understand that that's very time-consuming. It requires an enormous amount of engineering. Is there a way that we can actually imagine creating pools of capital that allow innovation that doesn't have to scale to $10 billion, a billion users, and cut every conceivable ethical corner around the way? Because that's where the market that we've got right now seems to be taking us.
So I want to back up just a little bit because I love this new world and this vision, but it wouldn't be an EFF podcast if we didn't talk a little bit about law and policy. And I wanted to ask, your view of, what are the kinds of laws and policies that we need to start pointing to help build this world? And of course, the one that I'm sure we agree on is the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act and the role that it plays in blocking research and innovation. I'd love to hear a little more about that. But what are the other ones that come to mind?
Well, so very specifically on CIFA, what I have been pushing for is a safe harbor for researchers. Mm-hmm. And by researchers, I don't just mean academic researchers. I mean activists, I mean journalists, I mean citizen scientists, anyone who sort of wants to understand what these platforms are. I think we need a safe harbor that isn't based purely on your behavior. It thinks about your intentions. And here's why. The same exercise that someone like Clearview AI went through to horrifically, unethically breach people's privacy and create a truly frightening piece of technology, a very similar project could have been a responsibly done scraping of social media to answer some of these fundamental questions that we sort of began the podcast with. Who's getting harmed? How would you mitigate those harms? So you can't just look at the technical behavior. You have to look at the reasons behind it. And you have to have this notion of public interest and a public interest exemption. And that's not the only thing I'd love to do with CIFA. I'd love to, wad the whole law up and throw it out there.
We got some good news from the Supreme Court this last term with the Van Dam case, and it gave us a little bit of clarity about terms of service violations and disloyal employee situations, which are fairly common. There's also Sandvig v. Barr, which protected researchers, and it's at the lower court level still, but there's so much more to do.
Sandvig versus Barr is inspiring.
Yeah.
It I hope is going to inspire a wave of professors trying to figure out how to take research projects and bring them in front of courts. I actually think that's a really terrific way to take advantage of having tenure and to take advantage of trying to get clarity around those things. One of the areas where I'd really love to see some work get done is adversarial interoperability. The vision that I have been talking about as far as social media cannot work without adversarial interop. I have a tool called Gobo that we started building at MIT. We're now going through another generation of it at UMass. It's a social media browser. It's an aggregator. It pulls your social media together and it lets you sort it in different ways. If you want everything in straight chronology, you can have it. If you want it so that cute cats filter the top, you can get that too. We can build that tool around Twitter because they have a great API and they're pretty good about third-party tools. We can build it around Mastodon. I even think we're going to be able to build it around YouTube, around Reddit, but we cannot touch Facebook. As soon as we do, they're going to send us a cease and desist. Yeah. And I don't think they're in their rights to do that. And so one of the strategies I'm really thinking about is, how do we get a ruling on that? Is there a way to get a ruling on that where I don't have to spend $5 million trying to figure out how to make my tool interact with Facebook, but I can actually get a court to say, no, you should have a right to this. You should have a right to be able to use a third-party service to interact with Facebook.
Let's talk, Ethan,
yes.
because I want that as well. And of course, EFF was deeply involved the last time somebody tried to build an aggregator and got sued out of existence by Facebook. But the law is changing, and let's talk. The first time a podcast launched a piece of impact litigation was right here.
This is where we go to mute for a bit now, and then we come back, and it's 2 weeks later. But yeah,
you are not. I have not yet retained Cindy as counsel. You never know what happens in the future.
Oh, but I didn't know you were going to show up and drop this catnip on me. You know,
I'm pleased that you think of it as intriguing. Yes. I will say a lot of the debates that are going on right now, I don't find super interesting. I don't find the 230 debate particularly interesting because I don't actually see a way through it that I feel particularly good about. Yep. Like I said, I can't really choose whether I would prefer having the government moderating Facebook or Facebook moderating Facebook. The answer is I would like users to be moderating users, but nothing within the 230 debate is sort of putting that on the table. And so where I'm focusing right now are on these quite technical arguments about being able to research the networks and then being able to interoperate with the networks in the hopes that we sort of build this future space.
I think the idea is that reform of the CFAA would give you kind of lots of opportunity, but there would also be this baseline. So Facebook couldn't just say to you, no, we're going to sue you from the get-go. They would actually be obliged to give you some connectivity into their network. Do you think that works?
You know, it's interesting. We saw the emergence of a consortium between people you would not think would be at the table together, Google, Facebook, Apple, Twitter, around exporting your data. So essentially leaving a service. And that, I think, was done in good faith and in good spirit. The only problem with it is that when you leave Facebook, your data is really only useful if you're going to another Facebook, right? So leaving is not actually the interesting thing. It's being able to interoperate with each of those small blocks of content. You want to have that sort of, export pass for each thing that someone posts on Facebook or posts on Twitter, and you want to be able to interoperate with those. The danger in doing this poorly is that you end up with some sort of a minimum operability standard that's so high that new networks can't connect to it, right? It takes you so long to be able to interoperate with it. So that's one of the things you have to fight against. The other thing that you have to think about, and this is areas that I think none of us really like spending a lot of our time, I don't think you can responsibly run a social network these days without some way of dealing with things like child sexual abuse imagery. And so whichever lines you want to draw, maybe it's around terrorism, certainly it's around child abuse imagery, there have to be some sort of central resources where you can put up fingerprints of your images and sort of say, I need to take this down. Even in the circumstances that I'm talking about, there's no way to deal with a community that decides that child porn is a great thing and we're going to trade it back and forth without having some of the central resources that you can work against. So if you really were sort of working for this decentralized world, some combination of the mandatory interop without too high a level of it and some sort of those collective resources that we in a field all work together on maintaining and feeding. With auditability, I understand that all those resources need to be audited and checked, and so you don't end up being in a responsible blacklist. Those feel like areas in which some really good work could get done.
I really think that we need to broaden our perspective about the problem, not just to the part where we find it, but to the part where we actually prosecute the people who are sharing it. And right now, our resources are really disproportionately aimed at the former and not enough at the latter. So I agree with you. We have to think about these problems, but I also feel like sometimes because there's tech, we only focus on the tech part of the problem. And I just don't want us to fall into that.
But you're absolutely right. It doesn't actually solve the problem, which is that people continue to abuse children and produce this imagery. And, that's a space where the tech solution alone doesn't get you there.
So we've talked a lot about this world, this better reimagined world where we've got smaller spaces, but people can move between them. What are the kinds of values that we're going to get if we get to this world?
I don't know if we're going to get this, but it's a hypothesis of mine. Robert Putnam, in his maybe too famous book, Bowling Alone, sort of mourns the death of democracy based on the fact that we don't join Elks Lodges and we don't go bowling together anymore. And you can read this as sort of an overblown anti-internet book and, we should all favor real-world interaction. But here's another way to read it. Those organizations, those sort of community-driven organizations were where a lot of us learned how to do small d democracy. We learned how to run a meeting. We learned how to manage a budget. We learned how to host a group discussion. We learned how to get people to work together to do things. We've lost some of that. And I think one of the best ways that people are learning those small d democratic skills are doing things like being moderators on Reddit. Are trying to figure out how to run virtual spaces that they actually have control over. So one of the consequences that I believe might happen out of the sort of networks that I'm talking about that are small, independent, federated, interlocking, but ultimately self-governing, is that we might become better citizens and better neighbors. We might actually learn, again, what those skills are about having a conversation with people that's constructive, rather than outsourcing the problem to poorly paid moderators in another country. Mm-hmm. I really do think that the answer is not just finding the next green field, it's finding a very different way to do it. And I guess I've just gotten very sick of the conversations that sort of start with, oh, good, well, first fix global capitalism. Well, yeah, I actually do fix global capitalism. And maybe a simple start on that would be to say, some part of the market can be public goods, and not everything needs to be a commodity, and not everything needs to be privately provisioned. And it's interesting that doesn't carry at all in the US, right? I can say it in academic circles, everyone's kind of laughing it off. It's actually taken dead seriously in Europe. And that's, honestly, for me, that's the most awkward thing about my life right now, is that I would really like to be in the Netherlands about half the time at the moment, because it's where I see traction for this.
Ethan Zuckerman, we could talk all day, but we have to finish. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh my gosh, what a pleasure. It's so nice to talk to both of you. I miss you both terribly. I'm really thrilled we can have this time to be together.
Me too. Oh, it is just so fun to talk to Ethan. He is so thoughtful about all of these things, and the enthusiasm he brings for the possibilities of a smaller future internet it's really infectious. And so we need to think about how we build smaller, more manageable places online, but also making sure that people can move between them.
Yeah, I think that it's all a question of scale, right? And I think he makes this great point that everything is ballooned up really because of the unique business model and venture capital funding model of the earlier internet. I love that analogy with dinner parties, in that we can wrap our heads around how to host a dinner party that doesn't end in a flame war. Sometimes it doesn't work, but the damage is limited, and we learn and we get better at hosting dinner parties, or at least I hope I will.
Yeah, I think that one of the tensions here is if we go back to Larry Lessig's 4 levers of power, we haven't developed the kind of strong social norms online that will help people figure out how to behave and also to be accountable when they misbehave. And so people are reaching for markets, and they're reaching for law, and they're reaching for other ways to try to control this on both sides, right? Right now we're in a moment where both corporate censorship too much and corporate censorship not enough are complaints that people have. And I love how Ethan pulls this apart and helps us think about our history and where we are. But at the end of the day, humanity's never figured out who we should give this powerful censorship tool to, especially if it's going to reach across communities and across different societies. The best thing is to have communities that set up ways that they talk to each other that everybody, learns and can abide by without somebody having to play the censor from on high.
Well, thanks for joining us on How to Fix the Internet. If you like what you hear, please tell a friend and follow our podcast. You can also follow Ethan's podcast. It's called Reimagine the Internet. And thanks to Nat Keith and Reed Mathers of Beat Moa for making the music for this podcast. Additional music is used under a Creative Commons license from CC Mixter. You can find the credits for each of the musicians and links to the music in our episode notes. Please visit EFF.org/podcasts, where you'll find more episodes, learn about these issues. You can donate to become a member of EFF, as well as lots more. Members are the only reason we can do this work. Plus, you can get cool stuff, like an EFF hat, or an EFF hoodie, or even an EFF camera cover for your laptop. How to Fix the Internet is supported by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation's Program in Public Understanding of Science and Technology. I'm Danny O'Brien.
And I'm Cindy Cohen. Thanks for listening.
This podcast is licensed Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International and includes the following music licensed Creative Commons Attribution 3.0, unported by its creators. Come Inside by Zepp Herm, featuring Snowflake. Perspectives by Jay Lang, featuring SackJoe22 and Admiral Bob. Zena's Kiss / Medea's Kiss by Emwick. Drops of H2O, the Filtered Water Treatment by Jay Lang, featuring Airtone. And Recreation by Airtone.